You've been measuring yourself by what didn't happen, what you didn't accomplish, the prayers that didn't get answered in the way you expected. But God, He's looking at something completely different. He's not grading your life on your wins and losses. He's watching your willingness. He's not waiting for you to hit some perfect version of yourself to love you. He's been proud of you while you were still in progress. You think God is counting the times you fell. He's actually counting the times you got back up. Let that settle. You didn't quit. You stayed in it when no one saw you. You kept forgiving when it would have been easier to grow bitter. You kept showing up with a broken heart. You kept trying even when you felt like it wasn't working. And maybe it didn't work the way you prayed it would. Maybe the doors didn't open. Maybe the healing didn't come. Maybe the people you loved didn't stay. But don't think for a second that heaven was silent. God sees the tears you cried that no one knows about. He heard that whispered prayer in the middle of your breakdown. You might have thought it didn't matter, but it did. It moved His heart. Because God doesn't just respond to perfection, He responds to pursuit. And you've been pursuing Him through your pain. You've been loving people when it cost you comfort. You've been giving when it felt like you had nothing left. Let me tell you something. Effort in the kingdom of God isn't wasted. Effort is sacred. That text you sent to encourage someone, that moment you put the phone down instead of saying something toxic, that choice you made to stay faithful in your job even when you felt unseen, that night you picked up your Bible instead of picking apart your life in worry. He saw it all and He smiled, not because it was flawless, but because it was faithful. God is not just proud of you when you win, He's proud of you when you try again. When you believe again, when you forgive again, when you show up again. That's the kind of faith that turns heads in heaven. See, in a world obsessed with outcomes, God is obsessed with your obedience. The world says, show me your results. God says, show me your heart. He's not asking for you to have it all figured out. He's just asking for your next step. So don't let the enemy shame you for what hasn't worked. You're not disqualified because you feel discouraged. You're not behind because the miracle hasn't come yet. You're not late. You're just in training. You're not forgotten. You're being formed. And in the middle of all of it, God is saying, I see you and I'm proud of you. Not the filtered version, not the polished worship leader Sunday service version. He's proud of the you that's tired and still trusting, the you that's hurt but still hoping, the you that doubts but refuses to disconnect. That's the you that heaven stands for. Because effort, real, gritty, quiet, relentless effort, the kind that no one applauds but God honors, that's what makes you powerful. That's what makes you dangerous to hell. That's what makes you dangerous to hell. That's what makes you favored. Not because you performed perfectly, but because you stayed faithful anyway. So walk today like someone who's seen by God. Walk like someone whose small steps are building a legacy. Walk like someone who knows even when it doesn't look like it's working, even when no one else says, good job, even when the fruit isn't obvious yet, God is proud of my effort. Because in His kingdom, effort isn't the beginning of the miracle. Sometimes it is the miracle. They don't know what it costs you to still be here. They see your smile, but not the nights you cried yourself to sleep. They see your strength, but they don't see the shaking behind it. You stayed when everything in you was screaming to run. You kept standing. When quitting felt like relief. And that's not weakness. That's worship. You had reasons that would have made sense to everybody else, but something in you said, no, I'm not done yet. God's not done yet. You stayed in that relationship longer than your patience. You stayed in that job when your faith was drying up. You stayed in the fight when it felt like you were swinging at shadows. You stayed in the process when you couldn't even explain the pain. And God saw it. Not 1 minute of your endurance went unnoticed. Not 1 second of your silent battle was wasted. He saw the moments you got up, not because you felt strong, but because you knew you couldn't afford to stay down. He saw you choose faith over feelings again. He saw you say, God, I don't understand this, but you followed anyway. He saw you hang on by a thread, and he called that victory. You thought staying meant being stuck, but staying was actually strength. Because strength isn't proven in comfort, it's proven in commitment. And the fact that you stayed, the fact that you didn't run from the fire, but let it refine you, that makes you more powerful than you know. You stayed when they didn't appreciate you. You stayed when they misunderstood you. You stayed when your name was dragged and your heart was breaking. And every time you stayed, you were writing a story of faith that hell couldn't erase. So you want to know what moves God? Not performance, not perfection, but persistence. You persisted. You stayed loyal to your assignment even when your emotions begged for an exit. That's why you're dangerous now. Because the devil hit you with his best shot and you're still here. The storm came, but you're still standing. The silence was loud, but you still listened. You didn't walk away from the promise just because it got hard. You didn't stop believing just because it got quiet. You're not the same as you were before. You're stronger, not because life got easier, but because you stayed when it got harder. You're deeper now, not because everything worked out, but because you chose trust over escape. And I need you to hear this today. God is proud of the way you stayed. No, really, he's proud of you, not just for your wins, but for your willingness to keep walking. That's what heaven honors. You didn't have clarity, but you had commitment. You didn't always feel peace, but you stayed in position. You didn't always have answers, but you trusted the one who did. You kept believing. You've been faithful in the shadows, and what God develops in the dark, he reveals in the light. So don't despise the fact that you stayed. That season didn't break you, it built you. And while the world celebrates the ones who arrive fast, God celebrates the ones who remain faithful. You didn't quit. That's your testimony. You didn't walk away. That's your strength. You stayed. And because of that, everything God promised is still in motion. Just keep staying where he told you to stand, because breakthrough doesn't belong to the ones who never feel like giving up. It belongs to the ones who feel it and stay anyway. You heard fear screaming, didn't you? It was loud enough to paralyze you, loud enough to make you question everything God ever whispered in the quiet, loud enough to drown out your confidence, your courage, your calling. But here you are, still walking, still believing, still breathing, and not because you didn't hear fear, but because you chose faith anyway. That's the part people miss. They think courage means you never felt afraid. They think faith means you never had a moment of doubt. But the real ones know faith isn't the absence of fear. Faith is what you activate in the middle of it. Fear told you you're not enough. Faith said, but I'm not alone. Fear said, what if it all falls apart? Faith whispered, but what if God holds it all together? Fear showed you the mountain. Faith reminded you who made it. You didn't get here because you had it all figured out. You didn't get here because you never cried, never panicked, never questioned. You got here because you believed through it. Because even when your knees were shaking, your soul was standing. You chose to step out when staying felt safer. You said yes when fear begged for a no. You spoke truth when it would have been easier to stay silent. You showed up to battles that weren't even yours to win because you knew who was fighting for you. And that choice moved heaven. See, faith doesn't always look like fire falling from the sky. Sometimes it looks like taking a step with no map. Sometimes it looks like choosing peace when anxiety has every reason to win. Sometimes it's standing still, not because you feel strong, but because you know your strength isn't coming from you. The enemy's greatest weapon wasn't what happened to you. It was trying to convince you to bow to fear because of it. But you didn't bow. You believed. You pushed through the panic. You leaned into God when everything else felt like it was slipping. And you may not even realize it yet, but that decision to keep your eyes up, to stay in the Word, to cling to the promise instead of the problem, that was faith in motion. That was you living louder than your fear. People don't always understand that kind of strength. They don't see the tears you cried right before you made the call. They don't know the thoughts you had to silence just to show up. They didn't hear the voices in your head telling you it was too late, too broken, too far gone. But God did. And He called it faith. He called it holy. He called it brave. He called it obedience. You walked by faith when fear had all the evidence. When you saved 2 unbelievers from the fire, they were brave. You called them out from the park, they were filled with fear. He called them out from the park, they were filled with fear. He called them out from the park, they were filled with fear. You called them out from the park, they were filled with fear. He called them out from the park, they were filled with fear. He called them out from the park. They were filled with fear. You trusted God with nothing but a word and a weary heart. You let go of control. You let go of comfort. You let go of needing every answer, and you reach for the only one who is the answer. That kind of faith, it unlocks things. It shifts things. It scares hell, because hell can't handle a believer who won't bow to fear. Now hear this. Your faith is working even if the fruit hasn't shown up yet. Your trust is building something that fear can't touch. And just because it doesn't feel supernatural doesn't mean it isn't. Every time you chose to walk forward when it would have been easier to retreat, that was heaven watching you fight with your faith. So don't let the volume of fear make you forget the power of your choice. You chose to believe. And because of that, God is building something in you that fear can't shake. You may not feel bold, you may not feel brave, but boldness isn't a feeling, it's a decision, and you already made it. You already walked through what you thought would break you. That's faith. That's victory. That's why God is proud, because you heard fear loud, but you trusted faith louder. You think the failure disqualified you. You think that one decision, that one weak moment, that one season where you slipped, somehow erased everything God saw in you. But what if the failure didn't disqualify you? What if it actually revealed how much grace was always covering you? See, we serve a God who doesn't measure you by the worst chapter of your story. He's not keeping a scoreboard of how many times you fell. He's watching how many times you got back up. People love to remember the fall. God remembers the fight. And if you're still here, still breathing, still seeking, even after all the mess, even after all the shame, even after all the broken promises and broken pieces, that means grace is still working. You let that one mistake define you for too long. You let that moment of weakness convince you you're not worthy of the promise anymore. But God doesn't write people off. He writes people into His plan. You failed. So what? You think God didn't see it coming? He saw the failure before He called you. And He called you anyway, because He never chose you based on perfection. He chose you based on purpose. You're looking at the dirt. God's looking at the direction. He sees the hunger in your heart, even when your hands don't feel holy. He sees your intention even when your execution was sloppy. He sees that you're still showing up, and that counts. That counts more than you think. You think you're behind, but maybe you're just in the middle. You think you're too broken, but maybe you're just in the perfect place for God to build something unshakable, because failure doesn't make you unusable, it makes you humble. And humble is the soil where grace grows wild. Stop rehearsing what God already redeemed. Stop replaying a scene that heaven already cut from the final version. That moment didn't destroy your destiny. It just revealed how much you need the one who never changes. you're not what you did, you're who he says you are. And he still calls you chosen. He still calls you loved. He still calls you his. You want to measure your life by a mistake? Fine. But God's measuring your life by the blood that already covered it, by the calling that hasn't left you, by the future he's still pulling you into. Don't let a moment of failure convince you you're not fit for the mission. That moment may have broken you, but it also brought you back. And that's what matters. You didn't stay stuck. You didn't stay silent. You didn't let shame win. You reached out, you repented, you returned, and heaven rejoiced. Because God isn't looking for people who never fall. He's looking for people who know where to fall, then fall again. And heaven rejoiced because God isn't looking for people who know where to fall. And if you fell at his feet, that's the safest place you could be. You thought it was over, but God says, I'm just getting started. You thought the failure was the final word, but heaven already wrote your next chapter. And it's not about the mistake, it's about the mercy that picked you up. So walk like someone who's been forgiven. Speak like someone who's been restored. Live like someone who knows God doesn't measure me by the moment I failed. He measures me by the grace I accepted afterward. You are not a failure, you had a failure. There's a difference. One is an identity, the other is an event. And God never called you by your lowest moment. He calls you by your future. So keep walking, keep believing, keep becoming. Because if grace was enough to pull you out, then purpose is enough to carry you forward.